Oh, hey there. Hey there.
Oh, sorry.
You go first.
No, you.
Well, I guess it doesn't really matter who goes first, because we'll reach the same conclusion either way. You're right. Much like the games for today's topic.
That's right.
This is just another video about The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Seasons, and Oracle of Ages. Hey, how about I cover the first half and you take the second? Sounds good to me. I'll leave it to you. Be back in a bit. All right, so here we are with a fresh new cup of Java, and yet it's covering 2 games? So what's the deal? Why didn't I split these into 2 different videos? Well, it's simple. In reality, these are 2 completely different games, but on paper, it's really like one game split into 2 different cartridges. Since these games were designed, programmed, and released on the same date, it only made sense to treat them as one Java as opposed to 2. So how did all this start? Back in 1999, Yoshiki Okamoto, the man in charge of Capcom's subsidiary company Flagship, proposed the idea of remaking the original Legend of Zelda to Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto. Wanting to create it for the Game Boy Color, he was actually asked to develop 6 Zelda games for the Game Boy Color, 2 based on earlier installments alongside 4 original titles. Which today would be absolutely insane. Can you imagine getting 6 Zelda titles on one console? Nowadays, we're lucky to get 1 Zelda title per console iteration, let alone 6. Okamoto originally wanted to release them in a quick succession of 4 to 6 months. At the time, he still planned to remake the original Legend of Zelda so the new generation of kids could play it, but also as a bit of a test for his team. Should they be successful, then they could continue on making new titles. While Flagship was put in charge of the scenario writing, the team led by director and designer Hidemaru Fujibayashi wanted to forego doing a remake and instead just wished to make a brand new Zelda title straight out the gate. As development progressed, it was deemed that the original Legend of Zelda was too difficult for the upcoming generation, so more and more changes were made until the world map was completely different. There were also technical limitations that the team ran across with the Game Boy Color, as it does not have the same aspect ratio of that of a TV, so a single room could not be viewed in its entirety without scrolling. Over time, Okamoto eventually would end up asking Miyamoto for help. It was then suggested that a trilogy of games should be made, dubbed the Triforce series, each one focusing on a different piece of the Triforce, with one of the titles being a convergence into the original Legend of Zelda. Unveiled at Japan's 1999 Space World event was the progenitor to Oracle of Seasons, going by the working title of Fushigi no Konomi Shikara no Sho, essentially translated to The Fruit of the Mysterious Tree, Chapter of Power. Later localized in the US as the Mystical Seed of Power, this was an action-oriented game in which Ganon kidnaps Zelda as well as the Rod of Seasons, throwing the seasons of Hyrule into disarray. The other 2 games, Mystical Seed of Wisdom, which focused on color-based puzzles, and Mystical Seed of Courage, which focused on the time of day to solve puzzles, were not shown. The plan was to have all of the games interact with one another, and you could play them in any order. Whichever game you finished first would affect the story of the next follow-up game. To do this, they came up with a password system, but this became too complicated with 3 games involved. So, per Miyamoto's suggestion, they scaled the project back to just 2 games. The Mystical Seed of Power became Oracle of Seasons, while the Mystical Seed of Courage became Oracle of Ages, which sadly meant that the Mystical Seed of Wisdom was scrapped. Due to the importance the team put on allowing players to enjoy the games in any order, as well as the multiple endings, it was never even considered to condense both games into one cartridge. And let's be real, I'm sure the financial perk of selling 2 games as opposed to 1 was also probably taken into consideration. Development continued for quite a while, with both games being released in 2001, with Japan receiving it in February 21st and the US receiving it a couple of months later on May 14th. Meanwhile, Europe had to wait all the way until October 5th. Regardless though, the games were a critical and financial success, selling 4 million copies each. There was high praise from many video game publications covering not only the graphics, but the vast amount of replayability. I don't remember if I saw this online or in a gaming magazine first, but I do distinctly remember seeing pictures of Oracle of Seasons and just letting my imagination go wild with the possibilities. At some point in time, I came across both Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages in a store with my mom, and managed to convince her to get me both. Purely from the box art and coloring scheme, it was easy to assume that Zelda was going the Pokemon route of things, by giving us the same game released twice, but with small minor changes to justify the double purchase. But I quickly learned that this was not the case. Personally, I had started off with Oracle of Seasons first. There was no real logic to this choice, it just happened to be the one that I decided to open and play first. In this game, Link ventures to a temple which houses the Triforce. The Triforce speaks to Link and informs him of the dangers in the land of Holodrum before magically transporting Link there. He wakes up in the wild, hearing music, and eventually finding a dance troupe led by Den, the Oracle of Seasons, and the dancer in the group. It's not long after this that General Onyx attacks, kidnapping Den, sinking the Temple of Seasons into the earth, and throwing the seasons in the land of Holodrum out of whack. This is immediately noticeable when the once sunny area Link had woken up in is now covered in snow. Link speaks with Impa, Zelda's retainer, who informs Link he should seek out the wisdom of the Mako tree at the edge of the town of Horan. Though first, to do so, Link needs to venture to the Cave of the Hero to acquire a sword. After this intro, the game continues on just like any other Zelda game, with the Mako tree requesting that Link go around and gather 8 essences of the seasons from various dungeons scattered around Holodrum. The first dungeon being reminiscent of Zelda 1's first dungeon. And it's in some of these map designs, as well as a few of the bosses, that you can really see how this started off as a remake of the original Legend of Zelda. After the first dungeon, you're able to travel east of Horan, when after tailing a hooded NPC, you gain access to the underground land of Subrosia. This is a second, smaller, yet still sprawling map for Link to explore. This is also where the Temple of Seasons, the home of the Rod of Seasons, is. Gaining access to the Rod, Link is able to jump on various stumps around Holodrum and swing it to change the season of the area. Starting off, you only have one season, but with the goal of returning to the different corners of the temple to access the other 3. Zelda games have always been known for their items as keys game design, meaning many dungeons and parts of the world map are often walled off until you get the necessary item from a previous dungeon to gain access to it. And most of these games, that just means you progress to a certain point in the dungeon, get the item, and now you can access a new part of the world map. And Oracle of Seasons is no different. However, adding in the Rod of Seasons really mixes up the formula just enough to make it unique. Once you gain access to a dungeon's new piece of equipment, it'll open up a path outside the dungeon, but it might not necessarily lead to another dungeon. Instead, it might lead to a new portal to Subrosia, which upon exploring might lead you to a new season for your rod, which will open up the world even further. I suppose this is as good a time as any to talk about the Rod of Seasons. As stated before, it allows you to change the seasons, but has limited range. While Holodrum is quite large, each section has a specific season that's always in place. For instance, just north of Horan, you will find that it is always winter, unless you change the season manually. This area is comprised of a set amount of screens, and these screens retain the same season. However, if you go outside that set of screens, and say you venture just a bit further north, you will find an area that is always summer, unless of course you change that season manually again. Depending on what season it is, it has an effect on where Link can travel. In the spring, flowers bloom which can shoot Link up a cliffside. In the fall, leaves cover holes in the ground, giving Link a new pathway, and the rock mushrooms are in full bloom and can be picked and removed. In the winter, water freezes, allowing Link to walk across it, and in the summer, vines grow, allowing Link to climb up cliffs. The season is represented by the color palette used, as well as a couple of other graphical changes. Once the rod is fully upgraded, Link will primarily have access to the entire world map. As for the dungeons, they aren't too terribly difficult because they are more action-oriented as opposed to the puzzles of its counterpart. That isn't to say that Oracle of Seasons doesn't have puzzles in its dungeons, there's just less of them, and it's supplemented by more enemies or more challenging rooms involving pits and lava. Each dungeon contains a unique piece of equipment for Link, and this is another area where Oracle of Seasons really shines. There are a lot of fun items this go around, including, but not limited to, the Rock's Feather, allowing Link to jump, which can then be upgraded to the Rock's Cape, allowing Link to jump even further, as well as the Magnetic Gloves. With these, each press of the button will change the polarity, and depending on if the polarity is set to north or south, Link will either be pushed or pulled towards objects. This can also be used on enemies as well. The top-down Zelda games have often had unique and fun equipment, and Oracle of Seasons is no different. Another new feature in this game, which is also shared with Ages, are the rings that Link can equip. As you explore, you'll come across various rings, be they from chests or from planting a gaseous seed in soft soil. Gaseous seeds eventually sprout into a tree, bearing a gash and nut containing an item of some sort, rings included. Taking the rings to a jeweler in town will allow Link to appraise them to see what they do. The rings have various effects, such as increasing Link's offense while decreasing his defense, preventing floors from breaking out from under him, and even transforming into another character completely. You can only equip one ring at a time, but it's a neat little addition regardless. Lastly is the flute system. There are 3 animal helpers, and you can recruit one of them to help you assist at the call of a flute. There's Ricky the kangaroo, who can jump pits, jump up cliffs, and shoot tornadoes from his fists. Moosh the bear, who can use his tiny wings to jump large pits and ground pound enemies. And lastly is Dimitri the Dodongo, who you can use to swim in the strong currents of the ocean or up waterfalls. He can even be picked up and thrown using the power bracelet. Throughout the story, you'll encounter each animal buddy to help you in a specific part of the map. However, depending on actions you take while playing in the game, you'll be able to acquire one of their flutes to call them practically anywhere else on the world map. Alongside this, shared in both games, are a group of screens that are entirely different, each one corresponding to one of the animal friends. For instance, the road to Sunken City can either be full of cliffs, requiring Ricky to navigate, full of large holes, requiring the assistance of Moosh, or it might be completely flooded with fast-moving currents, requiring the need of Dimitri. So that means Oracle of Seasons actually has 3 different world maps, and which map you get depends entirely on which flute you ended up with. After finishing Oracle of Seasons, you'll be given a password called the Secret of Labrina. Is it time for me to cut in yet? Yeah, actually. Take it away. Perfect. So, you take that password and... Hey. Can I... Oh, yeah.
Get some space?
Sorry. Do your thing. I'll be back. Ahem. So... You take that password over to Oracle of Ages, and when you pick a blank file, choose Secrets and input the password given to you from Oracle of Seasons. This will start a linked game. You'll notice that your character name matches that of Oracle of Seasons, and you start with 4 hearts instead of 3. You also start with a sword as well. So before we get into Oracle of Ages as a game, I'll explain the link system a bit more. When you play a linked game versus playing a new game, having 4 hearts and a sword aren't the only differences. The story is also subtly changed, as Link has become aware of a larger plot going on than originally thought. Throughout the game, you will find some different NPCs, including characters that moved over from Oracle of Seasons into Oracle of Ages. For instance, in Seasons, you'll find Bippin and Blossom, who just had a child and they ask you to name it. The same Bippin and Blossom from Holodrum have since moved over to Labrina, with their child retaining the same name and aging as well. Alongside this, there are also special NPCs that will give you secrets and ask you to return to Holodrum to tell somebody else. To do this, you need to load up your original file in Oracle of Seasons, track down that NPC, and tell them the secret from Oracle of Ages. Doing this will obtain you special items such as the Bigoron sword. Lastly, once you obtain the item in Oracle of Seasons, they will give you another secret to take back to Labrina. Booting up Oracle of Ages and going inside the Mako tree, you will find Feror, the Oracle of Secrets. Upon giving her the secret you learned in Oracle of Seasons, she will give you the corresponding upgrade in Oracle of Ages. While it's a lot of back and forth, it's actually really cool, and it helps you get immersed with the idea that this is the same Link traveling back and forth between 2 different regions of the world. Another change is the Hero's Cave, which has been transformed from a tutorial dungeon into a much longer and challenging, special, yet optional dungeon should you choose to conquer it. So Oracle of Ages takes place in the land of Labrina. Upon arriving in this land, Link meets Impa, who says she's looking for Nehru, the Oracle of Ages. After pushing aside a block containing an engraving of the Triforce and gaining access to the grove where Nehru is singing, it's quickly brought to light that Impa is not all that she seems. This is because she was possessed by Varan, the Sorceress of Shadows. Varan wastes no time in possessing Nehru, before using her powers of time to jump back to the past and wreak havoc. Which, can I say, I understand characters like disappearing, because if Varan is in the past, like altering things or killing people off, it's going to have an effect on the present. But why does this kid just turn to stone? Like, what did Varan do in the past to turn this one child into stone? Anyways, Link and the ever-annoying Ralph leap into action. Making her way to this land's Mako tree, Link's conversation is cut short when she suddenly disappears, as something seems to have happened to her in the past as well. Jumping into the time portal left by Varan, Link is sent hundreds of years back in time, and thus introduces us to the main mechanic of this game. Oracle of Ages takes place across 2 different time periods, the past and the present. This is shown with having a much darker color palette in the past, as well as all of the trees being dead for some reason. I assume the color palette choice was because we're transported to Labrina's version of the Dark Ages, and I guess the art team just took this literally by making everything much darker and dirtier. The music also changes to a different rendition of whatever area you're in as well. Link eventually acquires the Harp of Ages, which allows him to traverse time a bit more freely. Originally, he can only play one song that creates a time portal on these special tiles. The second song he learns will only allow him to ever move forward in time from the past, and the third song allows him to travel freely between the past and the present. Many of the puzzles in Oracle of Ages consist of doing something in the past to have an effect on the area in the future. For instance, moving a seedling to a cliffside in the past so when it blooms, Link can climb the vines in the present. Some areas can only be traversed by jumping back in time. You might be moving forward and suddenly reach a wall or an obstacle, but in the past that obstacle doesn't exist yet, so you travel back in time, move forward, and then travel back to the present to be past said obstacle. Much like Oracle of Seasons, there are 8 additional dungeons to be cleared to collect the unique essences in the land of Labrina. The dungeons contain their own unique items, some of which are completely unique to Ages, like the switch hook. This time around, they are a bit more puzzle-oriented, and some of the bosses even reflect this. The animal friends make a return as well. However, if you're playing a linked game, then whatever flute you got in Oracle of Seasons will be the flute that you obtain in Oracle of Ages. Alongside this, Oracle of Ages also has its own section of the map that is unique depending on which buddy you have. The ring system of course is here as well, and using the secret system you can transfer your rings from Oracle of Seasons over to Oracle of Ages. This is pretty huge because some of these rings can boost Link's attack power by a lot, so being able to start the game with them will allow you to easily steamroll past enemies quite early on. So you play through all of Oracle of Ages, and then what? Well, if you're playing a new file, then you'll beat Varan and you'll be given the secret of Holodrum, and you'll take that secret and start a linked game in Oracle of Seasons. But what if you're playing a linked game? Well, that's where the subtle changes come into play. During the game, Zelda will actually show up, having been kidnapped. You will rescue her, and then she will remain with Impa for the remainder of the game. However, after beating Varan, she will be kidnapped again by the Gerudo witches Kotake and Kume. It is then revealed that their big plan was to have Onyx and Varan cause as much chaos as possible to light these special flames, and by sacrificing Zelda to light the third flame, they can revive Ganon. Link will be able to take a portal to the Room of Rites to face off against the pair. Once they are defeated, they will use themselves to revive a mindless raging form of Ganon, which is the true final boss of both games. Beating Ganon and watching the true ending of the game, you will receive yet another password, being the hero's secret. This time, the secret is to be used on the same game that you beat the linked game on. So for instance, if you started with Oracle of Seasons and beat that game and used the password to make a linked game in Oracle of Ages, and then you beat that game and get the hero's secret, then you will use the hero's secret in Oracle of Ages. This will start a fresh file in Oracle of Ages, with the only change being that you have 4 hearts. However, it is still considered a non-linked game. This was done so that players can see the differences between the two games depending on the order that you play them in. So for instance, playing Oracle of Ages and linking that file over to Oracle of Seasons is the only way to see the conclusion to the Ambi subplot involving her long-lost love that you initially hear about in Oracle of Ages. In a linked game, you will actually find Ambi roaming around Holodrum in search of him. If you haven't already caught on, the replayability in these games is huge. Start a file in one game, and then link it to the other. Beat that game and start a fresh file with the hero's secret. Beat that game again and link it back to the first game. On top of which, having the different choices from one game carry over and affect the other game, and having so many different choices and so many different ways to play, it's huge. Especially when you consider that these games came out on the Game Boy Color. If you count the Oracle games as one Zelda game, and you really should, then they are easily one of the largest top-down Zelda games ever made. My initial thought that this was just the same game being sold to us twice couldn't have been more wrong, and I am so happy for that. It's really hard for me to pick my favorite between the two games, because it'd be like picking a favorite side of a coin. You need both for the coin to exist, just like you need both games to have the complete package here. And yet both games are so unique from one another at the same time. The Oracle series is an absolute must-play for Zelda fans. Hey, we wrapping up here? Yep, about to say the thing now. Cool. That being said, my name is AJ, and this was just another video about the Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Seasons, and Oracle of Ages.